Alright, Mr. Nintendo. We're not going to be doing much today. I'm just going to need you to take a look at these pictures and tell me how they make you feel. Does that sound alright with you? Don't want to be here. What is that shirt? Oh, it says, I heart copyright law. You like it? Pretty wrinkled, but I'm just a big fan of the concept as a whole. Okay, well, can I just show you these pictures now? I mean, I guess. Alright, here's the first one. How does this make you feel? Why are you showing me these? Just tell me how it makes you feel. Back! Get it away from me! Okay, wow. Let's just try another one. This one's even worse! How is this supposed to help me? These things are evil! You need to face your fears, okay? Try not to raise your voice, Mr. Nintendo. You are a sick man. Let's just do one more today, alright? Whatever. Okay, how does this make you feel? I'm getting my lawyers. What? Why? I'll see your ass in court.
Everybody, well, mostly everybody, loves emulation. It allows game systems to continue their life beyond their physical lifespan, gives players the ability to centralize all their games to one device, and also offers up countless settings and tweaks to make the gameplay experience even better than the original. They sound like a complete net positive, right? Well, Nintendo, among some other companies, doesn't seem to think so. In fact, their opinions on emulation lean very strongly in the direction of opposition. Essentially, they view emulation as an inherently evil concept that only promotes piracy and other illegal activity involving copyright infringement. However, if you even know the first thing about emulation, or you simply listen to what I just told you, it's obvious that is not what it is. So, why is Nintendo adamant about its negative position on emulation as a whole? Well, we can trace the origins of that all the way back to the inception of the most well-known rodent on Earth, surprisingly. Let's talk about it. Way back in the early 1900s, Walt Disney himself worked animating another character that wasn't a direct property of Disney, Oswald the Rabbit. However, after losing the rights to this character to another company, he was determined to gain exclusive rights to his own character. Obviously, this led to the creation of Mickey Mouse, and after his death, the Disney Corporation continued to push for copyright law reform, allowing longer periods for copyrights to be in effect before the property became public domain, which means it can freely be used by anyone with no legal repercussions. They managed to change copyright laws so much, in fact, that they extended the period of copyright from 25 years to an entire century in some countries, with most other countries not falling far behind that margin. This essentially means that most forms of media, including video games, will not become public domain until multiple generations have come and gone. Since this is a law, it obviously applied to other companies as well, who followed suit in enforcing the law that worked so well in their favor. I mean, why wouldn't they? It's essentially a law that allows them to win any lawsuit involving intellectual property instantly. They become bulletproof in that regard, and that's why it can be so dangerous to the general public. The biggest problem that arises with these laws in effect is the endangerment of game preservation, or media preservation in general. If the companies who own the intellectual properties do not make a conscious effort to preserve their creations of old, it is possible that the media will end up lost in the past, inaccessible by any person who wants to experience it in the future. This is a problem that is already painfully apparent with Nintendo. Now, from the outside looking in, you may think that this isn't the case. There's Nintendo Switch Online, which contains a considerably large collection of NES and SNES games to play as long as you have the online subscription. There was also the Virtual Console on previous Nintendo systems, in which they actually charged for the games individually. The Virtual Console had games ranging all the way from the NES to the Wii once it was all said and done. However, there's a sadder side to both of these options, as they don't offer up nearly enough to truly be considered a conservation library. Nintendo Switch Online's library of games, while it may seem quite large at first, is extremely limited, at least at the time of this recording. Sure, you've got a few classics, mainly the most popular games of the system, but even some of those are missing. For example, we still don't have Super Mario RPG, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Final Fantasy VI, and Secret of Mana, just to name a few. On the NES, it's not as bad, only missing a few notable titles like Duck Hunt and Yoshi's Cookie. However, it should be stressed that just because most of the bigger titles are on the service, it does not mean that this is an effort of complete preservation. There are still plenty of other games that didn't sell as many units, but are still loved and remembered by many people. Luckily, there are quite a few obscure games, or at least that I haven't heard of, included within the NSO library. I'm hoping they put these there because they genuinely feel that they matter, and not just in hopes it would make the library seem more expansive than it really is.
Man, this just isn't enough games. We gotta think of some more to add. Oh, I've got one. It's called Hey Punk, Are You Tough Enough? Master the moves to master me. You're telling me that's actually the title of a video game? Yes, look, I'm showing you right here. Put it in.
But, like I already mentioned, there's also the Virtual Console, which was the method of bringing older games to modern Nintendo consoles all the way up until the Wii U. Unlike Switch Online, these games were all sold separately. The downside of the Virtual Console, however, is even worse than Switch Online's. The Virtual Console almost exclusively included only the most popular titles on their respective systems. Smaller, more niche games rarely got the spotlight here, as it was likely they don't want the Virtual Console library convoluted with titles that not as many cared about. I should mention that there are a few outliers to this rule, but the general trend is that only the biggest games get Virtual Console spots. One advantage that Virtual Console does have over Switch Online is the sheer volume and range of titles available. Like I mentioned earlier, the games available range all the way from the NES to the Wii. However, the GameCube has never seen any Virtual Console releases, and has been left in the dust in general by Nintendo since the Wii for some reason. There are a grand total of over 300 titles available on Virtual Console, as opposed to the Switch Online's library not even hitting half of that. So the scenario becomes even worse now because it seems as if Nintendo is taking a step backward instead of forward in terms of game preservation when it comes to the Switch. One caveat should also be mentioned though. In some cases, it may even be impossible for a company to obtain the rights to a game, therefore completely preventing them from being able to preserve and distribute it. This can be the scenario for companies who created copyrights for their games, but the companies essentially no longer exist themselves. This is a very unfortunate scenario because no one can really do anything to obtain the rights to the property. This makes legally distributing these games nearly impossible even if they wanted to, so this may be the case with a small amount of titles, but obviously not all. A larger number of titles, however, possibly are being left with copyright holders because they simply don't want to give them up. It should be painfully obvious by now how protective some companies are over their intellectual property. And if they don't want their game preserved, they just won't allow a company to preserve it. Nintendo is no exception. Certain licensed games that you loved back in the day may not be obtainable by them because of these copyright problems. So, Nintendo isn't making the best effort at preserving their games. Why does this matter? Well, two things come to mind: inflated prices and lost media. At some point, if a clear, conscious, and wide-scale effort isn't made to preserve every game possible, one of those two scenarios will happen. Let's take a look at the former first. We've been seeing this happen for years now with older games that are either difficult or impossible to obtain and or play on modern hardware. Sites like eBay are the prime spot to jack up the price of your rare game and see who will fork out the cash for it. And don't get me wrong, it works. In fact, Nintendo's own seem to be the most popular type of game listed on the site. If there's a demand, people will supply, obviously. The bad thing about this though is that since these games are becoming so rare due to Nintendo's failure to offer them on newer consoles, the average consumer simply cannot afford to obtain them legally and play them on original hardware. At that point, their only option is to obtain a copy of a game through other means.
Not yet!
The other possibility is that of lost media. What if a game isn't popular enough to sell for thousands of dollars on eBay? Even worse, what if the console it sold on wasn't the most popular console of its time? The lower the popularity, the less likely the game is going to be talked about, sold, and even played. If the game and/or console sold considerably less units than their peers, then that also means that a lower quantity of that game is in circulation. Some video games are pushing 40 years old now, and eventually there will even be a very small amount of functioning hardware left for them to even be played on, simply because they've been lost to old age. Depending on the scenario, the likelihood of a game eventually becoming completely lost to time can get pretty high. This happens much more often with film than it does games, especially since the medium has been around even longer, but it is a threat nonetheless, and a considerably large one for more obscure games, who still deserve to be preserved just as much as the others. So, what's the solution to this problem? Well, the same thing I've been repeatedly saying that is absent from Nintendo platforms this entire time. A comprehensive, or almost comprehensive, library of all games from previous Nintendo systems. Now, I know that request is completely irrational, and I do not expect it to actually happen, at least not anytime soon. But, that still doesn't change the fact that most of these games are getting stuck on their original consoles, with no way to play them if you don't want to fork out the sometimes absurd amounts of cash to obtain them legally. So, with that said, you would think the solution to this problem is impossible, right? Well, no, and that is where emulation comes into the picture. Otherwise known as the ability to play games on a device different from the original or intended hardware. Whether it be a personal computer, mobile phone, or even another game system, emulation is extremely versatile, and, like I said, enables games to be kept alive far beyond their original shelf life. Additionally, many emulators have options to enable higher resolutions, higher frame rates, custom textures, and even mods, allowing you to experience the older games in even higher quality than the original hardware. So, why does Nintendo hate them? Well, they don't. Maybe. I'm not really sure. Take a look at this. On the Australian domain of Nintendo's website, they have a legal section outlining some common questions about intellectual property, copyright, and the use of their emulators outside of their intended mediums. One area outlines their opinions on the concept of emulators, with part of it saying, "A Nintendo emulator allows for Nintendo console-based or arcade games to be played on unauthorized hardware. The video games are obtained by downloading illegally copied software, i.e. Nintendo ROMs, from internet distributors. Nintendo ROMs then work with the Nintendo emulator to enable gameplay on unauthorized hardware such as a personal computer, a modified console, or another video game device." This statement, because of the way they phrase it, gives off the impression that even the concept of an emulator is against the law. They essentially imply that the only way to obtain copies of the games to play on an emulator is to download them illegally from the internet. However, both of these statements are completely false. Emulators, as a standalone program, are completely legal, as long as they can run without the presence of the BIOS of their respective system, which is essentially the code that boots the system up. If they function without that, they are fully safe. Additionally, the copies of the games, more commonly known as ROMs, are also completely legal as long as they are obtained by ripping the ROM from your own copy of the game using your own system. So, the wording that Nintendo uses on this legal section of their site is bordering very closely on categorically false and is obviously an attempt at fear-mongering toward the consumer.
Okay, welcome back, Mr. Nintendo. I am glad we were able to get that situation sorted out and not get the law involved. Did you know I really don't like you? Wait, are you still wearing the same shirt? Oh, I have more than one. Why did you bring the other one? In case you asked me about it. Still pretty wrinkled. So what are we doing today? Well, today we are going to be talking about your thoughts on emulation. And we're not going to be using the pictures this time, so you don't have to worry. It's illegal. No, it isn't. Hey man, it's just my opinion. No, it's not an opinion. It's literally just wrong, Mr. Nintendo. No, it's illegal. Why do you think it's illegal? Because I don't like it. Oh my god. You know what I do like though? What? Copyright law.
But here's the thing, Nintendo uses emulation themselves, a lot. every game on Virtual Console was emulated. Every game in the NES and SNES Switch Online library is emulated. 2 out of 3 of the games in the very recently released and then unreleased Super Mario 3D All-Stars are emulated. Additionally, they released 2 entirely separate products, the NES and SNES Classic Edition, that were literally just pretty looking emulation machines. They obviously see the value in emulation, so why do they seem to hate it so much when others utilize it?
You can come out now.
Oh, my head.
Piracy is obviously the main concern cited by that same legal section on the Nintendo website. They even go as far as to reference and maybe even brag about their quote-unquote aggressive worldwide campaign to stop the production and distribution of pirated video game products. They view it as a very serious problem. But what if I told you that the reason this problem exists all boils down to the actions, or lack thereof, of Nintendo themselves? As I mentioned earlier, Nintendo's library of legacy titles is extremely limited. Many games from previous eras have not seen a re-release in any fashion since their initial one. So, the only way to play this game, other than the original hardware, would be either to find a physical copy of the game online, buy it, wait for it to ship to you, buy a game dumper, which is sometimes really expensive, buy the system the game was originally on if you don't already have it, put the game into the game dumper, connect it to your computer, dump the game, move the game to your computer, open the emulator, and play the game. Or you could just go online and download the game illegally off of a ROM website. Surprisingly enough though, in the case of older games, neither of those options benefit or hurt the original developer. Let me explain. Now, the main reason for being anti-piracy is that it takes money away from the original developers of the game, and that is a very valid reason, in some scenarios, especially if the game is fairly new and on a current gen system. However, let's take the scenario I just mentioned when there's a game that was on an old system that may be either very difficult to find or unreasonably expensive. Let's also say that the game and/or system is not being produced by the original manufacturer anymore, so your only option is to buy secondhand. And finally, this game has never been re-released, ported, or remade in any fashion. If, hypothetically, someone were to pirate that game and emulate it, the company who made the game does not lose money in any fashion, whether indirectly or directly. The only person you could say even loses out on some money is the secondhand reseller of the game. This seemingly specific scenario is actually the case for many games across many systems, and it doesn't exclude the classics either. There are quite a few of those that fall into this criteria as well. So what's the argument at that point? Well, obviously, it's still illegal, and Nintendo seems to love enforcing the law just because they can, and that seems to be the most hypocritical thing about this entire situation. The vast majority of people don't pirate games because they don't want to pay for them. They pirate games because companies won't give them a way to pay for them. This isn't just something I made up either. Ever since the rise of digital storefronts like Steam, allowing developers to easily centralize all their games, new and old, into one convenient service, piracy rates on PC have seen a significant drop. Now, I know this will never happen, but what if Nintendo started putting their games up on Steam, either in packs or individually? I guarantee you they would sell like mad. I know many people, including myself, that would kill to have convenient and legal access to these games, let alone on PC, but in general. Oh, and one more thing. Let's go back to Nintendo's legal section of their website one last time. In the FAQ section of the page, there's a question referencing the benefits of emulation for game preservation, mentioning that it doesn't hurt anyone and allows gamers to play old favorites. Their answer is so hilarious and childish that I have to read the entire thing. The problem is that it's illegal. Copyrights and trademarks of games are corporate assets. If these vintage titles are available far and wide, it undermines the value of this intellectual property and adversely affects the right owner. In addition, the assumption that the games involved are vintage or nostalgia games is incorrect. Nintendo is famous for bringing back to life its popular characters for its newer systems. For example, Mario and Donkey Kong have enjoyed their adventures on all Nintendo platforms, going from coin-op machines to our latest hardware platforms. As a copyright owner and creator of such famous characters, only Nintendo has the right to benefit from such valuable assets. Let's pick this apart, shall we? They mention that games being referred to as vintage or nostalgia games is a false statement, immediately after referring to them as vintage in the previous sentence. After that, they follow it up stating that they are famous for bringing their popular characters back to life by bringing them to newer systems. Well, I hate to break it to you, Nintendo, but making a game featuring the character people are nostalgic for doesn't count as game preservation. I'm not sure how you came to that conclusion. But if that's not what you meant and you were trying to say you bring classic games to newer consoles, then sure, you're kind of right, but like I said earlier, just bringing the most popular titles back only solves a fraction of the problem. Your answer to this question completely ignores anything other than the most popular properties and titles. Also, why did they feel the need to mention that only they have the right to benefit from such valuable assets? What do you mean by benefit? It's not like ROM sites are literally charging people for downloads. That statement is completely irrelevant to the original question. Either way, at the end of the day, actual pirates are still going to exist, and they quite literally will never go away. Some people are just that cheap, but they are vastly outnumbered by people who genuinely want to support the developers of their favorite games, who are also real people, just as a reminder. Just like with many things, the bad apples of the group get viewed as the majority because of the bad stigma around them, even though they are actually a very small minority of the total representation of the group. I've already mentioned how much Nintendo likes to use the law to their advantage, but let's talk about some of the specific lawsuits relating to emulation and ROM sharing that have happened fairly recently. First off, let's go back to August of 2018. In the first week of this month, Nintendo sued two considerably large ROM sharing and emulation sites known as Love Retro and Love ROMs, which both came from the same host. These sites hosted hundreds of Nintendo ROMs and also allowed some of them to be played in the browser. Additionally, they even included downloads for the BIOS of certain consoles, which, as I mentioned earlier, can make certain emulators run much better. These are the illegal emulators, just to reiterate. The original amount Love ROMs was sued for was $2 million for illegal use of every trademark, plus $150,000 for each Nintendo game hosted on their site. In total, that amount ends up being over $100 million in the case of Love ROMs, an absolutely absurd number for a small site like that, which was actually only run by 2 people from what I understand. Obviously, Nintendo wasn't able to get away with that much money, but when it was all said and done, they managed to take $12 million from these people, all for offering downloads of games that they don't even sell anymore.
Please, don't take anything else. I am begging you. I am in $18,000 of credit card debt. My landlord is kicking me out and my wife left me. Shouldn't have uploaded All-Star Cheer Squad to the internet then.
And yes, I am fully aware that Nintendo is well within their legal right to do this, but that's not my point. My point is that most of the ROMs offered on that site could not be easily obtained anywhere else, and instead of offering them themselves, Nintendo decided to sue these people for every dollar they'll probably ever earn in their life. But anyways, very similar lawsuits for other ROM sites also closely followed this one, with Nintendo's latest rampage of takedowns ending around late 2019. It's inevitable that more will come soon, but the question remains of when. And yes, I will admit offering downloads for console BIOS was just a bad idea from the start. I really don't think they should have done that, as you can find an emulator for the majority of consoles that doesn't require a BIOS to function. Also, it probably wasn't the best idea to allow the ROMs to be played directly in the browser because of how easily accessible that is. Those two things are probably what got them targeted so heavily by Nintendo. However, other than that, this was just a site hosting ROMs for the purpose of preservation and easy access that Nintendo didn't offer themselves.
Okay, Mr. Nintendo. We need to have a serious talk. Is it about copyright law? Because I love that stuff. Actually, yes. The whole reason you came here to Chaps & Associates was to get help with your problem of abusing copyright law. I do not have a problem. It's the law, and I get to use it. I don't even want to be here, yet somehow it gets put on my schedule every week. Yeah, I wouldn't question that. What? Anyways, let's get back on topic. It just seems like we aren't making enough progress in each session. I'm gonna need you to start cooperating with me more. No, shut up. Why am I here? I don't schedule these appointments. The only reason I show up is because it gets labeled as meeting on my calendar. Yet somehow you managed to lure me in here anyway. Just don't worry about it. I'm sure someone's just mixing some things up. Okay, I don't believe a word out of your mouth. I'm getting my lawyers. Oh, no you aren't. You signed the agreement, remember? Do you have any idea what I do with people like you? Nothing, since you signed the agreement. I am out of here. Mr. Nintendo, I wouldn't do that. Eat
This isn't just an issue with legality, it's an issue with morality. In my opinion, and many others, Nintendo is not doing the right thing here, and I'm specifically referring to taking down sites hosting older ROMs from, let's say, at least 3 generations ago. Just for the record, if you pirate Switch games or any other readily available type of game, I do not support your decision and you are hurting people's livelihoods. But back to my point. If a game is that old and you aren't offering it with easy accessibility on your current platforms, then you gain absolutely nothing by suing the people distributing it other than the money you tear out of their hands. That small profit is nothing compared to the absence of game accessibility and horrible PR that Nintendo receives for being so ruthless. I understand that they are a business and their goal is to protect their properties to keep making money. However, like I said before, literally zero money is lost if they aren't offering the games themselves. So who's really at fault here? One company, however, in my opinion, does game preservation right. Say hello to Sega, the creator of your favorite blue hedgehog. They've opted to take on a much more relaxed attitude when it comes to emulation, and have made significantly more efforts than Nintendo to keep their games alive far past their original lifespan. Sega has the large majority of their games from all generations up for sale on Steam, and for the older games on the Genesis and Mega Drive, they have quite literally developed an official emulator for them. Let's just take a look at the intro that plays when you boot this thing up. Even on top of that, this isn't just your average emulator. The main hub for booting up games takes place in a virtual bedroom. Inside here, you can choose from your collection of games, change various emulator settings, modify inputs, enable online multiplayer, change the time of day inside the room, modify audio settings, view achievements for the games, and even play preset challenge scenarios inside quite a few of the games that test your skills. Heck, you could even just stare at the TV static if you really wanted to.
This game blows!
Even further, Steam Workshop content is enabled as well, meaning you can literally download and play mods of the games you purchase. Now, you're probably thinking, wow, that's pretty cool. I bet it costs a ton of money though. Wrong. I got the emulator along with 58 games for $7.72 USD. 58 games for under $10 on an official emulator that is leagues better than any of Nintendo's poor excuses for emulation. Now, I'm not saying that Nintendo should be charging this little if they ever made an official emulator. If they did the same thing with the same quantity of games, I'd honestly be willing to pay quite a bit more, especially if DLC was available that added even more games. However, the only thing that ever came close to this was the NES and SNES Classic, which were entirely separate pieces of hardware sold at extremely inflated prices that didn't include nearly as many games as Sega's emulation package did. What Sega is doing here is far more than just selling their older games on a different platform. They are preserving history, centralizing their properties for easy access, and most importantly, keeping the legacy alive for future generations. More people get to know about these games and enjoy them for themselves, and pre-established fans of the games get to relive the great memories they had when originally playing the titles. It's crazy how Nintendo continues to wonder why so many people are downloading ROMs off of unauthorized sites, well, simply because they have no other option, all while they continue to attack them to the fullest extent of the law, without simply taking a step back and realizing how easily they could prevent the majority of the illegal activity. And it's obviously not just some hypothetical theory either. A company has already done it, with great success and resounding praise from fans of their games. All Nintendo is doing with these aggressive legal campaigns is pushing their loyal fans away. And most of them, including myself, still love their games so much that we continue to hold on to the thread of a possibility that one day, just maybe, in the far future, they will finally come to their senses.